Southern Pacific fans think that I destroyed this Scaletrain's SD40T-2, which I customized to run on my modern BNSF layout. Follow my process and tell me whether you think this is a masterpiece or a mess on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and recently I received 3 Scaletrain's brand new SD40T-2 tunnel motors in N-scale for the sake of review. Now, the ones that I received, 2 of them were decorated for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Now, personally, I have always been a fan of the Southern Pacific paint scheme with the bloody nose and the speed lettering, but I modeled BNSF in 2008, so these just wouldn't fit on my layout. Or would they? I did a little research about the particular models that I had, the prototypes, and I found that one of them, SP number 8497, was eventually sold to the General Electric Leasing Corporation and was patched out with GECX reporting marks and was still running in lease service in the era that I modeled. So I decided that I would customize this model to make a completely unique model to run on my layout in 2008 in lease service. Now, again, many of my SP fans will probably say, oh no, you destroyed a perfectly good SP model. But for me personally, this allows me to bring a paint scheme that I love that otherwise wouldn't fit on my layout onto my layout in just a slightly different way. Now, if you'd like to see the review of these models that I did for Ron's Rail Reviews, I'll provide a link to that at the end of this video and in the description down below so you can check it out. But with that said, come along with me and I'll show you how I patched out and weathered this model to make a completely unique model for my layout. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. With 15,000 square feet of inventory and one-day shipping, whether in person or online, they are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. As I stated, I used a few reference photos that I found online to guide me in this project, specifically from Railroad Picture Archives. I don't have the rights to these photos, so I can't show them on this video, but you can Google GECX 8497 and find the same 4 or 5 photos that I used right at the top of the images list. Step 1 was to disassemble the model. I removed the couplers, which allowed me to remove the shell from the frame. I disassembled the cab and the interior and removed the handrails. I prefer to remove the walkway for a weathering project like this, but unfortunately this walkway was cemented in place, so I had to work around it. The model came with an unlit beacon light on top of the cab, which needed to be removed for the era that I'm modeling, so I simply cut it off and painted over the white spot where it had been. I began by applying a dot fade layer to the model. I've seen many modelers use this technique, but this was the first time that I had tried it. It uses oil paints dotted on the model and then streaked and blended to apply a general faded and weathered look. A variety of colors were used in this technique. In my case, I used white, dark gray that nearly matched the SP gray, burnt umber, raw sienna, and contrasting colors of green for the red areas and blue for the gray areas. Using a very small pointed brush, I dotted the entire model with these colors, concentrating more of the light colors high on the model and more of the darker colors low and in the shadowed areas. Once the dots were applied, I used a flat brush dampened with a little bit of thinner. I used Turpenoid, but many people prefer to use mineral spirits. I wicked most of the thinner off on a paper towel and then dragged the brush in downward strokes across the dots until they blended and disappeared into one another over the surface of the model. I didn't think the model was faded quite enough, so I let the first coat dry overnight and then applied a second dot fade. The trouble here is that the thinner will reactivate the first coat, so it's hard to layer these coats in this way. But with a little work, I got the amount of fade that I was happy with. I applied the same technique as a first step in weathering the trucks as well. I weathered the truck side frames on the model without removing them. I masked the motor and the wheels when doing anything that might overcoat onto them. You can also remove the side frames and weather them separately if that's easier for you. I also used the dot fade on the fuel tank. When I was happy with the fade step, I let the oils dry for a couple of days and then clear coated the entire model with acrylic gloss clear. The conductor side front cab door on the prototype was at some point replaced, and the replacement door was white with some rust and some weathering, so I carefully painted that door with white acrylic paint. The prototype lease unit has the Southern Pacific lettering on the sides of the long hood overstruck with black paint. It also has a black backing behind the reporting marks below the cab. For both of these applications, I used black trim film. I cut strips 6 scale inches wide. These came out slightly wider than on the prototype, which I believe now may be 4 or 5 inches, but the effect came out very well, so I have no regrets. I cut the strips on a sheet of glass to get a nice clean edge, and then cut them to length for each application. To apply the decals, I first soaked them in water for about 30 seconds. A jar lid works perfectly for this. I set them on a paper towel to continue to loosen from the backing paper. I applied a coat of microscale microset to the model where each piece would go, then gently worked the decals off the backing paper onto the model and positioned them with a micro brush and a pair of tweezers. Once each decal was positioned correctly, I used the micro brush to wick away excess water and microset and left them to dry. When they appeared dry, I gently applied a coat of Microscale's Microsol. This product softens the decals and allows them to form into and around the fine details of the model. You do not want to touch the decals at this point until the Microsol has completely dried. During the drying time, I found and cut the letters for the patched reporting marks from Microscale's decal set called N-Scale Alphabets Railroad Gothic White. I don't know the exact font on the prototype, but these looked really close if they were not an exact match. Now, cutting and applying individual letters like this in N-Scale is challenging to say the least, and it's not one of my favorite things to do. It just takes patience, and I'm always glad that they supply multiples of each letter because I nearly always mess up at least one. This is a great time to use an Optivisor for improved vision of these tiny decals, which is a great product to have on hand for any modeler, especially for N-scalers. I like the one that I have with multiple optics and a rechargeable light, and I'll post a link to it on my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description down below if you'd like to check it out. To apply individual letters like this and get them positioned correctly, it's important to have a starting reference point for placement. In this case, I wanted them centered under the road number, so I placed the center letters first and worked my way out towards each end. After all the decals had dried, I set them with a clear acrylic flat coat. The reference photos show that the white SP on the front of the nose was painted over with red, but it was slightly mismatched to the original color, and the SP showed through the paint faintly. To reproduce this, I masked around the SP and airbrushed it with Vallejo Model Air Red, a not-so-perfect match for the original red. The SP didn't show through the paint as much as I would have liked, although it does show through better in person than it looks like here on video. Let me just pause here to say that if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build your dream layout, then be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. To further weather the fuel tanks and trucks, I applied a mixture of burnt umber and raw sienna oils with a tiny bit of torn sponge. I love the 3D rust effect produced with this technique. I used a wash of light gray acrylic to leave tide marks that simulate minor heat damage to the paint underneath the dynamic brake blister and along the top of the long hood, as well as on the fuel tank. When that had dried, I used raw sienna oils to add some streaks of rust on the fuel tank as well. I also applied the light gray wash to the top corners of the red nose to fade that red paint a bit. Apparently I didn't film it, but the AC unit on the cab roof of the prototype is white, so I painted it such and used a black wash to blacken the grills. I used some of the same light gray wash to simulate faded paint on the top of the hood. Also, the prototype was much more faded on the sides of the cab adjacent to the side windows for some reason, so I tried to simulate this with a little extra fade. I used some black panel liner to simulate oil and grease around the bearing caps on the truck side frames. Diesel exhaust always leaves black streaking along the top of the hood. For this, I applied Monroe Model's grimy black weathering powder and worked it in with a small stiff brush. Turning to the handrails, I stuck them to a piece of painter's tape and randomly applied acrylic rust and grind colors to the stanchions. I didn't want to overdo this step and distract the viewer from the other weathering that I had done on the model. When all of this was dry, I applied a light dusting of a light tan color with an airbrush to simulate dust. For this, I applied slightly more to the truck side frames and the lower parts of the body, and less on the higher parts. After this, I removed the masking from around the trucks. Then I began reapplying the small detail parts and reassembled the model. Weathering in-scale locomotives so they look amazing in close-up photos is exceedingly difficult, as the details are extremely small and as the weathering sometimes can look overdone in these close-up photos. In this case, I think the close-ups look good, although certainly not perfect. At a normal operating distance and running on the layout, however, I think the model looks great, as I hope that you can see in this clip of the model running in consist as it will in operations on my layout. And to see more locomotive customizations and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. See my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below, as well as other valuable links, and join me on Fridays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I'll see you on the next one. 10, Lizzie?